Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 806, July the 27th, 1987. This past week we had an opportunity to hear George Schultz testifying before the Iran-Contra members of Congress, investigating the whole muddy affair that is getting muddier all of the time as these various witnesses begin to expose the operations of each other. And as George Schultz was talking about his being squeezed out of the operation and pushed aside, he being the old establishment teen, formerly president of Bechtel Corporation, advisor to Eisenhower and to Nixon on various cabinet positions to Nixon, and brought into the Republican team by Ronald Reagan, but he was being squeezed out as the military and the secret team took over, giving less responsibility to the older established politicians that had been around for a long time. And George Schultz talked about that very clearly this past week. On broadcast number 755, that was May 25th, 1986, just a little over a year ago, I did one broadcast on Schultz, and in that broadcast I said that George Schultz had to shape up or he was out. In fact, I did another broadcast titled, Is George Schultz Dead? In terms of he's completely dead as far as the secret team was working, and they had excluded him from major operations. I cited an article in the Washington Times called Oust the Schultz Movement. This was August the 2nd, 1985, just 2 years ago. And it cited 25 conservative organizations set up by Richard Veggery, the head of the Young Americans for Freedom, the group that helped put Ronald Reagan into office, and a lot of pressure of the hard right movement to get George Schultz out, and Schultz is no flaming liberal. Then there was a full-page advertisement in the Washington Times, August the 17th, 1985, with large letters, Mr. President, you have been badly served by George Schultz. He's working with Marxist-Leninists in Mozambique. And this is Oliver North and Robert McFarlane and Admiral Poindexter pushing Schultz out and calling him a Marxist-Leninist, as they want the secret government to be even more secret. And then the Washington Times had another full-page ad that same time period, a week later. This was September 23rd, 1985, titled Schultz Policy. He's an ally with Marxism. Then all of a sudden, after the 1985 period, they worked over George Schultz. And then there was an article, large article, Libya rated triumph of Schultz policy. He's America's #1 hawk. And at the time I said he either had to shape up and become as far right as them, or he would be out and they were going to move around him. And that's what he was testifying about this past week, which coincided exactly with the dates that I was trying to explain this to people that listen to World Watchers. Also, that same broadcast, May 25th, 1986, I cited some information regarding a lawsuit in California, in Santa Cruz County, a Muhammad Kalish Lee, L-E-I, who filed a suit May 6, 1986, saying that a man affiliated with the CIA told him, in quotes, we have a problem over in Ethiopia, and we want to take some people out. And the method, he said, that is there would be poisons put into spirulina, into algae that the people ate, and the poisoned algae would be produced in Bakersfield, distributed to northern Ethiopia around a Lake Tano area. He refused to do it, and because he refused to do it, he lost his status as a student from overseas and was not able to continue at Cabrillo College. That was a year ago this May. Just past 2 weeks, July the 3rd, 1987, there's an article in the San Francisco Chronicle, Algae offers a way to ease hunger. Lake Turkana, Kenya. Scientist Stephen Ngunya dreams of a massive growth of weed as an end to African famine. The Kenyan botanist suggested that they send to Ethiopia this algae. Spirulina is not a new discovery. The Spanish conquistadors found it used by the Mexican Aztecs, and spirulina fans tend to be enthusiastic about it. And this article is about easing hunger in Africa, and a way was devised to end the famine, and they would begin in Ethiopia with this algae. And this particular person who came from the area felt that a year ago that there was evidence that this solution to African and hunger could be genocide, and a year later I see that this becomes the great solution to give these people a chance to eat the algae and wean the population from fish that they're dependent upon or meat, and make them accustomed to the spirulina. So we'll see what the death rates are in Ethiopia or Africa about 4 years from now. It's too soon to tell. Now, all of the articles about George Schultz calling him a Marxist-Leninist came from the Washington Times, a newspaper owned by Reverend Moon. And there was a long article, July 20th, 1987, in the San Francisco Examiner, titled Evidence Points Oliver North's Ties to Reverend Moon. Now, the Tower Report had a list of names and banking connections that North used, and it had CAUSA, C-A-U-S-A there. And so far, the National Wire Services and the investigators haven't even touched the connections of Reverend Moon, because he's part of that inner secret team working against the established elected officials. And this one article goes into some of the connections of North to Moon. And it said from mid-1984 through 1985, when the Boland Amendment was in effect, Moon sent $1 million in supplies to Nicaragua around the Contra bases. And 6 weeks after North recommended establishing a tax-exempt foundation to send weapons to Nicaragua freedom fighters, they call them, he formed what was called the Nicaraguan Freedom Fund. And the Washington Times publisher Bo Hai-Pak, one of the top Moon political lieutenants, established a fund with the identical name, the Nicaraguan Freedom Fund. North had an institution by that name, and the Moonies had one also. A note found in North's files links PAC and CAUSA, that's the organization that was named in the funding charts that he had, the name of the Moon-dominated political groups. To Oliver North, they were linked, and to the Contra Support Network. One of CAUSA's USA's advisory board members is a controversial San Francisco priest, and his name is Tom Dowling, and I'll be doing more on him now. And his research outfit got $100,000 from a Contra leader and from a company that North used to launder Contra aid. In 1978, Senate Subcommittee investigation on Moon's behalf in the United States, the influence buying said that Moon affiliates made up a single organization whose goal was worldwide theocracy under Moon's unification church. And this, again, is the Poindexter North team that you see testifying that they make the proper decisions and they're the top persons. They don't have to tell the president what they're doing. And they're both very closely linked to the goals of Reverend Moon's unification church. This article says each Moon-linked organization insists it is independent of each other, but officials of the organizations acknowledge helping to provide hundreds of thousands of dollars in what they called humanitarian aid. Tom Ward is the chairman of CAUSA in New York City. A book published in 1986 called Inside the League, that's the World Anti-Communist League, by Scott Anderson, and John Anderson said, Moon affiliates spend millions of dollars since the early 80s. They promote the Contra cause. They work with far-right military and political forces. In Central America, Moon supporters are influencing and influential in several countries that have supplied secret Contra aid, such as Taiwan and South Korea, Moon's native country. Moon recently had been imprisoned on an income tax evasion bout. While in the prison, he did work that was crucial for the Nicaragua government. 2 Washington Times reporters have been aides at the National Security Council in the Reagan administration, and that's very interesting that a newspaper owned by Reverend Moon had 2 aides from the Mooney organization in the National Security Council in the Reagan administration, and one of them is Latin American specialist who worked closely with Oliver North from 1981 to 83, and then, of course, they went under after the Boland Amendment and continued to work and have their contacts, but before that, they were relatively above board, if you wanted to know who they were. There was a report from Bob Havel, a member of the Mooney Connections. He says, I've heard no mention, of course, in all these months of a connection between the Iran-Contra Committee, the House investigation, and the Moonies. You haven't brought it up, which is true, but the Congress, the House and Senate, are protecting the Moon organizations, and then they went on to say there is a close series of connections between Reverend Moon's supporters and retired General John Singlaub and the World Anti-Communist League. And, of course, Singlaub was one of the witnesses who was treated so gingerly, and he had access in and out of the National Security Council, the Pentagon, and as a retired general can work with the Mooney Organization and with the World Anti-Communist League, all on the same goals, all working together. And this article goes on about the Nicaraguan Freedom Fund, which is a tax-exempt corporation with the identical name as the one that the Moonies started, which is hard to separate. In May 1985, just after the congressional vote where money was cut off, the Washington Times launched for the Contras. The Washington Times launched a $14 million Contra aid deal called the Nicaraguan Freedom Fund. The Moonies, with $100,000, started with their publisher, Mr. Pack, and the next link between the Moonies was Oliver North's April 18, 1985, thank you letter on National Security Council stationery. North Secretary Fawnhall wrote the letter to Phil Mabry, a Texas supporter. The Tower Commission found it in North's file. Mabry is an official of the Moonies. On the letter were handwritten notes linking members of North's network and conservative activists with weapons, funds, and trips to Germany and to South Korea last year with the organization CAUSA and Colonel Bohai Pak. Mabry later acknowledged he received the note. A spokesman for Pak's CAUSA organization denied any other links to North. One member of CAUSA-USA, the advisory board, is in San Francisco. That's the clergyman Tom Downing, and he went to Congress and testified on the needs of the Contras wearing a Catholic priest outfit disguised as a Catholic priest, and he actually works for the Moonies, and he goes down to Central America and says Mass for the Contras in Honduras. He makes speeches around the United States under CAUSA sponsorship under Reverend Moon and also under the sponsorship of Oliver North, and North arranged his speeches. Dowling is an executive of the Latin American Strategic Studies Institute. His colleague, Neil Barrington, said all of the Contras money came from North-funded Contra leader Adolfo Calero and IBC, and yet it's very much linked to Oliver North's entire relationship with the Moonies, and it is Reverend Moon's newspaper that was calling George Schultz the Lenin Marxist, and large articles on why he shouldn't be in the State Department because they wanted to clear him out so that Poindexter, North, Casey, and others, the secret team, could have access to as much time to do the operations they wanted around the world, and Mooney Organization is a world organization. The Washington Post had a story 2 weeks ago, July 3rd, 1987. Tongstun Park returns with debt unpaid. Tongstun Park is back. He was a key figure in the South Korean investigation of influence buying. He's very close to the Mooney, part of the Mooney Organization. He owes the government $1.2 million in taxes. He hasn't paid it, and he's never harassed about it. His new address is a house on Fox Hill Crescent, recently purchased for $634,000, but he has not paid off more than, it's not $1 million, it's $10 million in back taxes that he owes the United States. There's liens of $6.65 million, back income taxes pending. The liens are from assessments going back to the early 70s. The government did not issue another park company. The government did not pursue another company that he owns, Sutter's Tavern Corporation. He's the owner of a $1.2 million Georgetown Club property on Wisconsin Avenue. The IRS cannot explain why Sutter's Tavern assets have never been seized. So that the Moonies have a lot of influence in the Internal Revenue with the parts of the government that don't harass them. And this article said Park returned to Washington periodically over the past decade. He has small parties. He has parties with the aid of money from the Korean CIA, and he so far has no criminal prosecution. Nobody has seized his assets. In 1977, he was charged with bribing members of Congress and getting legislation that was favorable to Korea. And this is a time period when Reverend Moon moved in with his newspaper and took over the mindset of the conservatives in Washington, D.C. But so far, any charges he has were dropped in 1979 and never continued. Park's family has been in the news in South Korea. Recently, his brother, Ken Soo Park, head of the country's largest shipping company, killed himself by jumping off a building under investigation for embezzlement of taxes in South Korea. But nobody's jumping off of buildings in the United States, and there is a lot of money available to these people and their organization. and they are linked to the Oliver North setup and the National Security Council and William Casey and so forth. I was talking last week about Kuwait and the flagging of the ships, the United States ships, for the very, very wealthy country of Kuwait, who seems to be buying up a lot of the land, real estate in America and Great Britain, corporations in Germany. And I asked the question, what does it cost to flag the ships for this very, very wealthy country that's really better off economically than we are? Well, in the Larry King program last week, Vernon Walters, our UN ambassador, was guest, and Larry King asked him what the cost was of flagging the United States ships in the Persian Gulf, and Vernon Walters made some dumb remark and smiled and wouldn't answer the question. The San Francisco Examiner answered the question Friday, July 21st. Gulf Armada estimated to cost $1.7 million a day for the United States taxpayers, and it protects Kuwait Oil Company, which is not an American company, which belongs to Kuwait, and it raises this confrontation with the oil countries, raises our price of gasoline, and then the price of gasoline goes to buy more weapons for these countries to fight each other, and they'll buy the weapons from us and other countries around the country. The United States is spending at least $17 million a day to maintain an armada of Navy fleets, fighter jets, and aircraft in the Persian Gulf. One of the reasons for other countries not participating, some are going to, but some of them not very much, was the explanation they didn't have the money. Well, we don't have it either. We have debts, and I think it's pertinent now to say what this cost, because there's been criticism of the Iran-Contra Committee and the prosecution charging many millions of dollars for investigating the crimes from the National Security Council, the CIA, the Defense Department, the White House. But the cost of the investigation is cheap compared to the cost of putting this money to keep these ships in the Persian Gulf. The CBS report estimated the annual cost of operating a giant nuclear carrier is $140 million a year just for one carrier. It could be cut to $120 million for a small non-nuclear constellation, but operating a cruiser is $98,000 every single 24 hours. The daily cost of the four ships is $400,000, and the cost of protecting the ships, the oil company in Kuwait, is $1.7 million a day. The Japanese don't spend that to protect the ships. They spend it in corporate money buying up the United States as we go broke, defending the means by which they get their oil. There was an article in the New York Times, July the 9th, titled, "Fighting the Good Fight. North's view is that a band of patriots opposed by a hostile and unreliable world." It's written by R.W. Apple, Jr. It's a long article. I just want to cite several paragraphs of it. The witness was trying not only to justify his own behavior and that of the administration he served, but also to persuade the American public of the validity of its fundamental conviction that the Soviet Union and the United States are locked in mortal combat. And I'm sure you don't add up what mortal combat would cost this country, not speaking of other countries. Then there's another paragraph. In a sense, Colonel North's sharp exchanges with John Niels Jr., the committee counsel, represented another chapter in the prolonged struggle which dates back to at least in the mid-1960s. That's just before John Kennedy was sworn in as President of the United States, over who controls American foreign policy. He, North, argued, as have presidents and other presidential aides, that the executive branch is supreme, and Mr. Niels argued that Congress had a role as well, and that the public had to know what was going on. Now, Oliver North's argument, because he's under Ronald Reagan, and he's the son that Reagan never had, they have so much in common, he said the president is supreme. But starting in the 1960s, Robert Mayhew was hired as part of the FBI, CIA, and the National Security Council to hire the long-known narcotics dealers and death squads under the tutelage of Santo Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and John Rosselli. And the reason they were hired in just before when John Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon was that in case Kennedy, the president, didn't conform with the way that the military wanted the world to be run in the United States, then the president could be killed, and he was. So the president is not supreme. What is true, and he argues, the one who controls foreign policy is the president. He argues that. But that argument is wrong. The Defense Department has the contingency that if the president doesn't go along with the Defense Department, he gets his head blown off. And Oliver North is only saying the president makes decisions, but you heard John Poindexter testify. There were decisions he didn't have to tell the president because he knew what the president wanted. And when the president said, no, that isn't what I wanted, Poindexter said, you don't know what you wanted. This is the way it is. We make the decisions, and I'm an admiral. And the president doesn't have to be told what we think. So the contingency was made for somebody higher than the president, over the president, to make the decisions. And North isn't defending the president because they cut out the president of the decisions. North, the colonel, and Poindexter, the admiral, are defending the military decision for what they think is a mortal combat between the Soviet Union and the United States, and they are linked and prepared to die in the process of having this fight. Jack Anderson had a story this morning, July 27th, called A Shadowy World. And it's a very important article, but I just want to cite one paragraph, similar to the opinion in the New York Times article of what this is about. He said, we described William Casey in 1983 as a loner who operates out of his hat. He lives in a continuous state of crisis, whose mind is encased in a Republican hard shell, who talks of Soviet-American relations in terms of showdowns. Now, it isn't Casey's hat. A showdown that he wants, he learned that from being in the OSS. He learned that when Allen Dulles was working with Hitler's top agents in Bern, Switzerland. He learned that the road was set by 1943 for World War III. That didn't die with Casey. That wasn't Casey's hat at all. Casey was an instrument to make it possible in every country to get rid of any moderate people and put fascists in power and use their countries as bases all over the world to begin the showdown with the Soviet Union. And the things that I've been talking about on World Watchers many, many years are coming into prominence in the reading material that's being published by the newspapers daily, not by the television news, which is just terrible. But there is a lot coming out, and now they're specifying that there is this intentional goal of World War III, and that's what's on their mind. And the Unification Church is a one-world government, and Mooney is very much part of the NSC, with people from the Mooney organization on the board of the NSC and advising and tying together elements of World War II, such as Ryosha Sasakawa, who put the Mooney business together, and then the newspaper was a result of that. They have many publications. But this is a policy that was made before World War II was over, and to isolate it to North, to isolate it to William Casey is wrong, but the intentions are very clear as they're printed in the newspaper lately. Now, Edwin Meese is going to start testifying tomorrow, and for many of you who get these tapes, he will already have been testifying, maybe be off the stand by then. And the Wall Street Journal had an article about him this morning. Meese's vagueness is expected to vex the Iran-Contra panel, who want to fill up the gaps, that he's not going to be able to recall events. He's going to be like Admiral Poindexter. He's going to be vague, and there will be significant gaps in the understanding of the affair. Now, many of the significant gaps will be because the members of the House Intelligence and the Senate Intelligence don't intend to give away their secrets of exploitations, of coups, of planned murders of heads of states. They just don't want it in the hands of a few, and also, when the hands of the few get exposed, they have to act righteously indignant so that they can then say that team is run amok, but we're different. So Schultz was vague. He remembered some things, but he didn't have to forget a lot because they didn't ask him hard questions, and when they asked him one, he got feisty, and he changed the subject. Meese is something else because he was so close to always the President of the United States. He came to Washington from California, and they had a particularly close relationship. In March 1984, and for about 6 weeks after that time, I started a series of broadcasts on Edwin Meese and the judiciary hearings on making him the Attorney General. He came in and became the Chief of Staff for Reagan at the White House, and then he was to replace William French Smith in 1984. the Senate Judiciary hearings were taking place at that time. On broadcast 639, this was 3 years ago, I had various items about Meese. One about Meese tied to the Superfund and clinging up pollution a political matter, delaying decisions that were causing cancer, and how he was on the board of Dart Industries with William French Smith and Northrop that were holding back money to clean up pollution that Governor Brown had been allocated to use because Brown was running against Pete Wilson for the Senate and they wanted Pete Wilson to win. This past week, July 27th, there was an article by Pete Wilson, Oliver North is a hero. And Pete Wilson also, I made the allegations in 1984, was for Central America funding of death squads and also death by chemicals. So he's defending North, of course, now, and I linked him 3 years ago to death squads in Central America. I also mentioned in that same broadcast Edwin Meese and the news media, that he didn't trust the news media, that an institute was formed in San Francisco called the Institute of Contemporary Studies of San Francisco. It was formed by Edwin Meese III, and he made no secret of his distrust for the press. And you may have seen articles this past week about the use of the Pentagon secrecy to not take care of, to be on hand to see what happens in the Persian Gulf and the delay of people going out to the Persian Gulf, hand-selected by the Pentagon. Well, it was Admiral Poindexter and Oliver North who began with a grenade invasion by saying the only people that can be present at the time of a military invasion or altercation and so forth have to be hand-selected and pass the test of the Pentagon. And the very first day the ships are out, or 2 days later, there's a attack on one of the ships, a mine, and a lot of questions. How did it happen? It even seemed too coincidental. Well, this is the kind of provocation that Meese set up with the Defense Department. He hated the press, and he worked along with Poindexter and North for secrecy. I also talked on that broadcast about Edwin Meese and Western goals and discussed the Reichstag possibility of a garden plot, Reichstag meaning that you produce or provoke an incident where an agent provocateur or group of them cause violences whereby you bring in the federal emergency management system. And I cited an article by Ron Wiedenauer in the L.A. Herald on Edwin Meese, a planned military takeover of the country. And April 30th, 1970, Meese and the California police were working with persons from Georgia, Washington, and so forth on the possibility of a coup at that time. Ron Wiedenauer just came out with an article in Village Voice, the same material, on the FEMA organization Edwin Meese and how it goes back to Operation Chaos in California when Reagan was governor and Meese was in charge. And also I referred to Edwin Meese, the interest in reactivating the military position during Reagan's possible Olympics Reichstag operation. Now, the Soviet Union didn't send their athletes to California, and I believe that that would be the excuse for creating that federal emergency management that at the time Poindexter and North were very active in. We could kidnap the Soviet athletes and create incidents, and Edwin Meese had persons that he was putting into jobs in the Selective Service. He was with the Selective Service and was promoting and had access to draft resistors and so forth. He also had his hands on home loans, the post office appointments, and I was discussing Edwin Meese and the stolen Carter papers that were to assure Ronald Reagan's presidency. This was 3 years ago, on March 5th, 1984. This past 2 weeks ago, July 5th, the Houston Post had an article, Reagan's aides linked to theft, the Carter papers. Now, that case has never been finished. It has to do with William Casey and a parallel government that, among other things, has been linked to the theft of briefing papers. This is just coming out now again, and I was talking about Edwin Meese's role to taking Jimmy Carter's papers with the help of the National Security Council, and now the name Oliver North comes into the picture of William Casey, and a lot of hanky-panky that took place that did, in fact, assure Reagan's presidency and assured that William Casey would become CIA director, and the links to the October 80 papers that were stolen. The briefing papers are again in the news, and I was talking about those 3 years ago. We'll take a 1-minute break and go back to, or follow with things I had about Meese 3 years ago on World Watchers and update them with what I'm seeing in the news today and some important appointments and decisions Reagan has made in the past week that also link to the Edwin Meese affair. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of broadcast 816, in case you picked it up in the middle of the first half hour of the program. And I'm going over points about Edwin Meese that I brought up 3 years ago, and these current names now that weave together and become more meaningful for you. It's hard to understand these names when I throw them out. That's why it's good to have tapes of these broadcasts or the sheets that accompany them, because years later you can go back and see how I put their activities together a long time ago, and that what they refer to as a secret team has been operational for many, many years, and particularly came into real power as soon as John Kennedy was murdered November 22nd, 1963. Regarding the broadcast on Edwin Meese and the stolen Carter papers to assure Reagan's election, I also linked the great William Casey, the secret Casey, who has his own secret spy system, and the offices of Robert Keith Gray, and the connection of Gray to Edwin Wilson, and this is very important, and to George Bush. Well, when the Iran-Contra affair opened up, Robert Owen, the liaison of Oliver North to Mr. Calero and the Contras stationed in El Salvador and in Costa Rica, Robert Owen came from the offices of Robert Keith Gray and then connected to John Singlab of Western Goals, and all of these people were operational and visible going back to 1984, when even questions of what they were doing were in the news at the time. There will be a lot more literature out also on the October 80, not only stealing the papers from Reagan's desk, but the October 80 surprise, the plan to rescue the hostages in Iran. Reagan sabotaged that, and all the people involved with him around his position got cabinet positions in these times. There's a long article about that by Barbara Honegger last week, and I understand LA Weekly is going to publish her story. It is a very detailed account of stealing an election. I had accused Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese of planning to use the Federal Emergency Management Agent to stage a coup to cancel our elections, to round up Central Americans, blacks, and have a police dictatorship. At the time of the hearings last week, when a member of the Congress asked Oliver North about FEMA, Mr. Brooks asked him, Representative Brooks asked him about the plan drafted by North for the Federal Emergency Management Agency that suspends the Constitution and individual freedoms. The report first put in the Miami Herald July the 5th. Inouye said, "I believe the question touches upon a highly sensitive and classified area," Inouye said. He told Jack Brooks, "So may I request you that you not touch upon that, sir?" And Brooks said, "I'm particularly concerned because I read in the Miami papers and several others that there had been a plan developed, a contingency plan in the event of emergency that would suspend the American Constitution, and I was deeply concerned about it and wondered if that was the area in which he worked." Inouye insisted that Brooks reserve the question for a closed session, and he said, "I read it in the newspaper, front page story," and Representative Inouye said, "We can't discuss that in public," and Brendan Sullivan, of course, said that the inferences are ridiculous. Another article from, this is San Jose Mercury, Inouye halts questioning by Representative Brooks on a plan to suspend the Constitution. "We can't hear across the nation on television coast to coast what you're lucky enough to read in the Miami Herald if you want to." Warren Hinkle wrote in the San Francisco Examiner, "The unasked questions loom large." And it said, "The fix is in. There are limits to questions that are allowed in the overblown inquiry," as when Representative Jack Brooks attempted to open a line of questioning about North's plot to suspend the Constitution and turn over the government of the United States to the hacks and Gipper's old boy buddies at the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Brooks was slapped down. The lid is clearly on raising any issue that may be any more embarrassing or destructive to the Contra cause than the mess that has already surfaced. And this is an article on not allowing us to have a chance to hear this material. Another Miami Herald article tells about David Boren asking Lieutenant Oliver North. He said if he helped draw up a controversial plan to suspend the Constitution in the event of a national crisis. And I ask you, and North said absolutely not. Boren asked North if he knew of the plan, if the plan had been adopted, and he said, no, sir, none. Well, the plan was drawn up when Reagan was governor, and the question was asked, did you write it? I ask you, did you write it? Well, North didn't write it. It was already written. He didn't help draw it up. That's a true answer. It's been drawn up, at least in California, since 1970. And he can say, I didn't draw it up, and he may not even known about the adoption of it because he's there to help the rounding up, and he's not familiar with the plan. The Miami Herald, in another large article, July 19th, Sunday, North helped make wartime plans. He had one earlier, July the 5th, and then he had another one on the federal emergency management, and North's role indeed, and had to do also with our exercises in Honduras. People's Daily World had an article July 21st. North's testimony reveals a threat to the constitutional order, what he wanted to do with our Constitution. And Spotlight, the very conservative newspaper, has 6 pages, July 27th issue, the Spotlight overview, an in-depth look at the federal emergency management ready for a coup in the United States. And this is 6 pages, and it goes into the agencies involved. The Attorney General, Edwin Meese, was a longtime planner of the United States police state, involved since the California days, and it goes into the Garden Plot operation in 1973, and a man named Guy Frieda, who has now been replaced by another person, but they still have the same plans. And their readiness was to deputize the Defense Department, the State National Guard, and to let the military take over. This very conservative Spotlight has a picture of Jack Brooks and Inouye, and a large section of the article. Brooks wanted to ask about FEMA's Rex 84 plan. Inouye stopped him, and Spotlight continues that they have through the years revealed the federal emergency management plan. And of course, I've had that on the air. I've been on the air since 1971. And another large section of this article from Spotlight, FEMA justifies its existence with nuclear Holocaust scare. And the July 5th article in the Miami Herald says that Oliver North carried the football that could trigger World War II, an atomic war, for Ronald Reagan for a time period of over a year. And then they have a large map of where FEMA would work when the coup takes place, and a section called Congress is ignoring scandals in the agency of the Federal Emergency Management, and how they're looking over the allegations that have been made by different people about this particular agency. And then on the back page of their article, they have warning issued years ago, the history of the executive order, which has never been defined by Congress, and how it came about that Congress has created a secret crisis. They could devise a secret crisis, a classified emergency, and how they could, similar to Adolf Hitler's Reichstag when the building was bombed, blame it on a communist and then round people up. So this is a very serious thing that even the most staunch conservatives, not the fanatics Poindexters who want a World War III, but the very staunch conservatives are afraid of this military team in the White House, even more afraid than the liberal press, if there is a liberal press, and they have cited, the various references that they've had through the years. On Broadcast 653 back in 1984, I had a section on the Federal Emergency Management and cited an article from Inquiry, gotten out by Jonathan Marshall, California's own political police, the OCCIB, the Organized Crime Criminal Intelligence Branch. It was formed in 1970. This was the underpinning or the beginning of the FEMA program, and it involved the North American continent and regional intelligence and a clearinghouse for law enforcement under Errol Younger, and it also tied into the California Los Angeles Police Department and to Western Goals that was created in 1979, and Carl Spitz Chanell is head of Western Goals and has been since Larry McDonald was killed in the Korean airline. as I say, Edwin Meese formed an institute in San Francisco to figure out ways to get around the news media. And July 23rd, there was an article across the wire services. Military had delayed 5 dispatches from a pool of reporters into the Gulf. They said yesterday they delayed the distribution of people from their news pool for 4 days, and they even threatened to kill Americans who were on the scene, and we could have instigated a ship being attacked, and it may not be Iran, but it would be an excuse for us to hit Iran, typical to the Adolf Hitler Reichstag operations. And then after a few days, there were articles, Pentagon sets up press pool in Gulf, and it says that this press pool was set up after a grenade operation, and now it's begun to be put into work. Because of the situation of Admiral Poindexter, who's described as so dangerous, and Oliver North as dangerous as trying to overthrow the country with a coup or steal the government, it seems to me that it would be imperative to undo the rule they did. When they're out of office, the Pentagon still has the right to decide who can take pictures, what journalists can be aboard, who can see what is happening. And in the Persian Gulf, a 10-person pool was warned to stay away from the tankers, while the Marines in a helicopter leveled machine guns at them. They were going to shoot persons, Americans also, with machine guns if they photographed incidences in the Persian Gulf because they were not appointed by the Pentagon. So again, we're going along with the Pentagon's decision that we have to take what they say, but we can't have an objective person there. And those decisions came after 1983 with the invasion of Grenada. In 1984, 3 years ago, on Broadcast 640, I was talking about Edwin Meese and his links to there's a problem. An airplane crashed in California. Actually, it was in Mexico where 7 were killed, and involved a gentleman, Bill Donovan, the brother of George Donovan, a millionaire in California, who had arranged a Libyan loan for Jimmy Carter's brother, for Billy Carter, and 8 people were arrested in conjunction with a narcotics ring that involved these same people. And Bellamini's son-in-law was the object of a 1980 Senate investigation, and it had to do with imports and drug money from Thailand and Billy Carter and Libyan money and Jimmy Carter. And on program 558 earlier, I talked about the plane crash that involved the brother of George Bellamini, who had helped Billy Carter get oil, and the connections of Charter Oil to Robert Vesco and Libya, and the Democratic side of this drug-dealing, arming terrorists. Just as Ronald Reagan is arming Khomeini, Jimmy Carter had persons close, his brother, and persons close to Gaddafi arming Libya. Now, I bring that up at this point because of the elections taking place between Carter and Reagan, and there isn't much hair's difference. On the front, it appears there is, but not much difference between the two. And one of the interesting points that shows there isn't much difference between the two, and I'm just brushing off quickly what I did in March of '84, that was 3 years ago, on the links of the Carters and weapons to Libya and narcotics money and Robert Vesco, because Vesco is a partner of defense, 2 people, defendants in the Christic Institute now, Mr. Escobar and Jose Osha, and Arthur Lyman comes from the law firm that represents Robert Vesco, and the committee, of course, is going easy on all of these subjects that would affect Vesco and the connections, or the Democrats or Republicans. But there was another article in the Miami Herald, and I guess Alfonso Chardy, Chardy, gets the award for the Iran-Contra information that just keeps flowing out. He's an excellent reporter, and he has an article, U.S. sought to blur the ties to the Hasenfus crash, and there are 2 items in this article that are very important. The main thrust of the article is that after Eugene Hasenfus landed in Nicaragua, Assistant Secretary of State Elliot Abrams was making considerations or plans in the White House to have the Contras accept the responsibility. It was our plane. We raised our own money. The plane crashed, and Mr. Cooper and Sawyer and Hasenfus and the 4th passenger were our people, and have a distance between Central America and Washington. Of course, Hasenfus right away had mentioned Robert Owen, who comes out of the Robert Keith Gray offices and the National Security, so it's hard to cover that one up. But the article goes on to say that memos were found regarding a Mr. Canestraro, That's fairly new name to people who are studying the Iran-Contra affair. His name is Vincent Canistraro, Canistraro. He was in the CIA, then he went to work at the National Security Council, and he was sending memos to the NSC and working with Elliot Abrams on how to cover up and distance the White House from Eugene Hasenfus. An interesting point of the memos is that he sent one to Abrams, and Abrams approved, according to the Canistraro memo, was that they should recruit an appropriate lawyer for Hasenfus and raise private funds to pay him. Another decision that Abrams and North coordinated. On October the 12th, 1986, there's a North memo reprinted in the Tower Report. It said that before Reagan left for his Iceland summit meeting with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, he was briefed about a plan to raise $100,000 to hire a high-powered attorney for Hasenfus. The memo doesn't say whether Reagan knew that Hasenfus was working for the United States government, but he knew that his Assistant Secretary of State, Elliot Abrams, was raising the money to keep the Contras alive, which is one of his main projects of his administration, and that they were bringing to him and the National Security Council the fact that they would be raising $100,000 for a high-powered attorney. So the denial that Reagan knew that Hasenfus was working for the government is a technicality, because he knew Oliver North worked for the United States government, and he knew that Abrams worked for the United States government, and he knew that Casey worked for the United States government. So if they want to get an attorney for Hasenfus, and they should be distancing themselves from him, why would they tell the president they're going to put this money up for an attorney? Now, one of the things that got Richard Nixon out of office were the tapes that showed the part of the cover-up where E. Howard Hunt and various Watergate defendants were going to be guaranteed a large amount of money to just plead guilty to being on their own, and therefore it wouldn't link to the White House, and the cover-up part linked to Richard Nixon and was his undoing. So the Tower Report says that Reagan was privy, and they sat to and discussed a fee for Hasenfus. Then he was part of the cover-up for Hasenfus, separating what he did down in Central America from the White House. But then this article concludes by saying that Abrams' office coordinated with Eugene Hasenfuss's wife, and she went flying around down there, and they had the names of 3 prominent American attorneys that they could approach. Now, the White House must have done a little research on this, and of the 3, all 3 are Democrats. And all 3 of those Democrats are linked to the broadcast that I had, number 640, March 1984. They were former Attorney General Griffin Bell, who did in fact represent Hasenfus, former Secretary of State Cyrus Vance, who resigned as Secretary of State because of the attempted hostage rescue, fatal one in 1980, and former Vice President Walter Mondale. Now, the Carter administration was tied to Robert Vesco, to Libya, to arms to Gaddafi, and activities that were going on just identical to what Ronald Reagan was doing, and they're connected with each other and not separate. So it's interesting that the White House, covering their ass, their behinds, would let 3 Democrats be chosen, a pool, take one of the 3, and Griffin Bell, a former Attorney General under the Democratic administration, was to bail out Ronald Reagan for being linked to Central America by getting Hasenfus out of the country fast. So at the time that Jimmy Carter ran against Ronald Reagan, I did broadcast on the fact that there wasn't any difference between them. The only difference was the narcotics turf and who was in power and who selected where the drugs flow. Also, in 1984, in the series on Meese, this is program number 641, I was talking about the California county is rapidly tightening its grip on the Justice Department. This was an article in the Washington Post when Meese was nominated to be Attorney General, and he brought with him Dr. Lowell Jensen from California Justice. Ronald Reagan made Lowell Jensen a judge. And then I went into the influence of Meese also in the weeks to come with medical associations, and this is very important, and his ties not only to Las Vegas slot machines and so forth, but to the medical institutions in California and to the institutions of biotechnology and genetic altering and the use of scientific institutions as political connections. And I had a segment on April 2nd, 1984, broadcast 643, The Cancer Connections of Edwin Meese, Henry Kissinger, Ryosha Sasakawa, Wild Bill Donovan, Elmer Bobst, Helene von Damm, Daniel Ludwig, and the Politics of Cancer. Ryosha Sasakawa in 1987 is very active in AIDS. And then this is a story how Meese got in the red ink with a $15,000 loan to buy 200 shares of America Cytogenetics. And they make tissue samples for the diagnosis of cancer. Now, there's a big escalation in the disease of AIDS to become a multi-billion-dollar business, and these companies that Meese had loans, some loans to buy their stock, going way back, could be listed to the AIDS testing and have to be checked out. There's another article in the Houston Post, too little attention to finances for Meese's woes. And he didn't remember the loan to biotechnology. And then I broke down the relationship of Helene von Damm, who came to this country through the American Medical Association, and the links of Wild Bill Donovan to cancer, medical experiments, and how he was put on the board of the American Cancer Society by William Bill Donovan of the OSS. Now, there are articles this week about the appointment of the Commission on AIDS that Ronald Reagan appointed. Before that, I might say the Houston Post had an article July 20th, Religious Right is cashing in on AIDS epidemic. Profiteers benefit from other misfortunes. They're going to make billions off of it. Another story from the New York Times, July the 9th, AIDS cost in 1991 will be $2 billion for New York City alone. That's a minimum for NYC, and of course it can go up any amount, but the cost to the city recently was $450 million. They need billions for the city. Another panel on AIDS leading towards wider testing. This is a response to the commission that Ronald Reagan appointed this past week, the Advisory Commission on AIDS. Republican State Representative Penny Pullen of Illinois sponsored legislation to mandate testing people who marry with AIDS and their sexual partners and trace the AIDS carriers going back 7 years to everybody they slept with. She's been appointed on the commission by Ronald Reagan. Dr. Corey Servas, editor of the Saturday Evening Post and medical director of the Foundation for the Preventive Medicine, has been also called getting an AIDS as a patriotic duty. We have to give these tests to everybody. It is your patriotic duty to have premarital testing and so forth. Now, Ronald Reagan has put together a team that's just amazing. The AIDS researchers and activists are mad about this team they put together, and one of the members said, I think they're thumbing their nose in our face. They're saying, okay, you want a presidential commission? Look at this cast of characters. You'll be sorry you ever asked for a commission, said Richard Dunn, executive director of Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York. It's a joke, said Andy Humm, spokesman for the Coalition of Lesbian Gay Rights. It's not a war on AIDS, it's a war on people with AIDS. And New York Times has the story, the Reagan AIDS Panel, and I'll read several articles that describe the 13 members of this panel. Colleen Conway Welch, professor and dean of nursing at Vanderbilt University in Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee. She represents the views of the nursing community that care for AIDS patients. She's from Howard Baker's home state. John Creedon, chief executive of Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, who's going into the implications of the AIDS epidemic for the insurance agencies. What will it cost us? And if it costs billions in every city, you can be sure they'll be rounded up. Teresa Crenshaw from San Diego, director of Crenshaw Clinic, is pointed to the commission. She argues that there should be changes in sexual behavior to stem the spread of AIDS. In other words, get the homosexuals to become hetero again, because reliance on condoms are like putting a mere balloon between ourselves and a deadly virus. So as part of the American Association of Sex Educators, Counsel, and Therapists, she argues that you have to change them back from being gay. Richard M. DeVos, co-founder and president of Amway Corporation, renowned for its expertise in door-to-door sales, active in Republican circles, was chosen as an official He represents a company that is active all over the country, and we wanted to make sure we had folks on the commission who are the average Americans. Alexander Haig, the protege of Fritz Kramer, is on the board of Amway. Amway is a very, very far-right-wing organization with tentacles and links to South Africa. Richard M. DeVos, the co-founder and president of Amway, and maybe you know the politics of Amway, maybe you don't, is going to be on the board of looking into the problem of AIDS. Burton Lee, a practicing physician from Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, a major AIDS treatment center, particularly for lymphomosis, a form of cancer, is on the board. Frank Lilly, chairman of genetics at Albert Einstein University. He's not worked on AIDS itself. He did research on animal diseases called retroviruses, similar to AIDS, and he was picked to be on the commission because he's the only homosexual on the commission. Woodrow Myers, a health commissioner in Indiana, known for the state's early work on AIDS. He's the only black on the commission and he may look into special insights into the needs of the black community because black heterosexual and homosexual are dying a large number of AIDS. Then Reagan puts on John Cardinal O'Connor, the Archbishop of New York. He's been active in assisting AIDS patients, which is not true. The New York Times says that was one of his positions. A stern moralist who equates homosexual practices with the biblical scene of sodomy. He opposes the New York efforts to promote condoms to prevent AIDS, and he believes that there should be religious values or perspectives in the discussion of the disease AIDS. And then Penny Pullen from Illinois State, the one who believes all people who get married should be tested for AIDS, and if a person is indeed afflicted with AIDS, you should go back 7 years in everybody that he's had sex with. And another member on his commission is Admiral James Watkins, a member of the Knights of Malta, chief of the naval operations, because he's active testing in the military all the men and women to see who has AIDS. This is a very crazy kind of a group that Ronald Reagan has appointed, which is indeed a insult to people in AIDS, the military, people getting married, into the black community. There's an assault upon everybody. One person who wants to change their sexuality back, another who believes it's a sin, religious sin, to be homosexual, and he's stacking with the far right, straight heterosexuals, and it's really a very sad, pathetic situation. Oh, he also has William Walsh of Bethesda, Maryland, project and medical director, president of HOPE, and clinical professor of internal medicine at Georgetown University. I also believe he has on this board the publisher of Saturday Evening Post. The New York Times said that Mr. Reagan said the members were drawn from a wide range of backgrounds and points of view. They were chosen by White House officials with little involvement by top federal public health officials at all who deal with AIDS. Mr. Reagan said he received helpful advice from Dr. Loyal Davis, the father of his wife, Nancy. Now, Loyal Davis has been dead for at least 2 years, so it's interesting that he's accrediting this list of right-wing fanatics to the AIDS Commission to look into AIDS when the man is dead. And maybe he's working with William Casey up there helping out this problem of AIDS. But this is going to be, I bet, a real roundup, check them all, isolate them, and a genocidal activity that's going to continue. That is very, very frightening. I did have programs 3 years ago, 1984, April 16th, titled Ronald Reagan is Ready for War. Reagan endorses preemptive raids against terrorism. Secret meetings, April 3rd, 1984, National Security Decision Directive 138 to increase intelligence collection at home, create killer teams to wipe out before these terrorists get strong. And another article from the San Francisco Chronicle, question of war looms behind the Nicaragua debate. And this is where Oliver North and Poindexter had worked with the Federal Emergency Management to take over the country and suspend our constitutional rights if and when they decide to invade Nicaragua. And it was George Schultz, the great Marxist-Leninist, who threatened just about a month ago that if we didn't support the Contras, then we would send the military into Nicaragua. And, of course, if that brings a response, then we respond back with a police state. So these are very dangerous times, made more dangerous by Senator Inouye and this committee that will not allow us to know more about Oliver North other than who wrote one memo and what was destroyed that we'll never know. But among the stuff he destroyed from, I'm sure, from October through November, he started when Eugene Hasenfus landed, probably were the links of rounding people up done out of his office with Admiral Poindexter and the connections of the retired generals such as Thinglaub and Secourt and so forth with soldier of fortune types rounding people up along with the National Guard. My time is up now. I hope you are watching those hearings and keep watching them. They are just fascinating, every single word. I thought I could do other things like separate articles while I listen, but I don't want to miss a word of the hearings, and we will be talking about them for a long, long time to come. This is Mae Brussell from Pacific Grove, California, and I'll be back with you next week with more on World Watchers.